Welcome to episode 128 of Stageworthy. I'm your host, Phil Rickaby. Stageworthy is a podcast about people in Canadian theatre featuring conversations with actors, directors, playwrights, and more. The Fringe season is upon us, and in the coming weeks I'm going to be talking to a lot of amazing Fringe artists. And you're going to want to make sure that you don't miss anyway. And one way to make sure that you never miss an episode of Stageworthy is to subscribe to the podcast. And subscribing is easy. All you have to do is go to Apple Podcasts or Google Music and search for Stageworthy, then click the handy subscribe button. And if you like the podcast, I would love it if you'd leave a comment or rating, because your ratings and comments help new people find the show. If you want to drop me a line, I would love to hear from you. You can find Stageworthy on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website at stageworthypodcast.com. And if you want to drop me a line, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Phil Rickaby, and my website is philrickaby.com. My guest this week is playwright Eric Petersen. Eric's play, Final Exam, is part of the 2018 edition of the Toronto Fringe Festival and will be presented at the Matty Ackler Recreation Centre in Toronto's East End. So we'll just jump in.
All right. Is it recording already?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'll cut out anything where we're if we're saying anything terrible about people.
Yes.
Because people suck.
Not the people coming to our show.
No, of course not. Of course not. Those people do not suck.
So come to our show and you won't suck.
Why don't we start, Eric? So the show, full disclosure, I'm in the show. And it's called Final Draft.
No. Final Exam.
Final Exam. Boom. God damn it. So the show is called Final Exam. Do you want to take a second and describe what the show is about?
Sure. So imagine a time, 25, 30 years in the future, and we're in the audience enters. You're in a high school setting. You're in a classroom with the students and the teacher. And it's unclear whether your biggest concern is taking the exam or the fact that aliens are coming and they're going to swoop you up into the hive mind. Now, for most of us, this wouldn't be a tough call, but apparently for many of our students, they're torn between what is causing them more anxiety.
That's true. And the hive mind is like something that's being forced on everybody, right? It's like, in theory,
there's some escape hatches, and the aliens aren't taking everybody. So everyone that's around is seeing some benefit, and certainly their parents do. And I had earlier drafts where I talked about how employers were going to assume you were going to be part of it.
Right.
And so there were many more, things kind of forcing people into this decision. Sure. I cut most of that out. I just said, you know what, people have to accept the fact that everyone around here's basically bought into it and going forward.
Yeah. What was your was there something that sparked the idea for this for you?
So it's been in my head for a while, actually, and I think it just was kind of interesting for the genesis. Actually, was kind of thinking about Alan Bennett's The History Boys, which is a play set in England about a whole bunch of kids who managed to get accepted into Cambridge or Oxford, and I thought it was kind of interesting to sort of play with that idea of looking at the teacher-student relationship in the context. Well, what would happen if the Borg, essentially some kind of hive mind, showed up and sucked everyone into it? Like, what would happen with teachers and students? And
sure.
And so the original one was maybe a tiny bit more elegiac. That doesn't quite sound right. But the the teacher thinking about his future and being excited to know all of literature all at the same time, but knowing that he wouldn't be as special.
Yeah.
And it kind of changed from there, but that was kind of the very original. I would say the last couple drafts have been much more inspired by two things. Number one being Brexit, particularly in the context of England, where you see a big generational split, and an awful lot of the younger generation are extremely bitter toward the older generation about making these decisions for them that they, on the whole, didn't support, and are like, well, you had your choice, you decided against it, but, I wanted to travel to Europe. I wanted to be part of the EU. And that's gotten a little muted in this version, but nonetheless, there's flashes of it. And then I guess the second, which has probably kind of dominated the last couple drafts, is discussions about privacy, and particularly in context of Facebook, where you have many people knowing there's pretty substantial and significant problems with it, and yet continuing because their employment requires them to be on Facebook, or being pretty nonchalant about it, saying, well, privacy doesn't really matter, who cares? And that's particularly sort of the younger generation of millennials. Like if you cut millennials in half, like the younger group just don't see privacy the same way at all, as far as most of the surveys can say. Yeah.
That's an interesting thought, in that, they've grown up in, there's this particular, we're in a society where, there's the attitude of, well, I don't have anything to hide. And I guess that's the case until there's something that you want to hide, Like, why does privacy matter, except that, you don't necessarily want everybody to know everything about you.
Well, I think, even just from a philosophical perspective, it's generally a good idea to reserve parts of yourself and not put them on display all the time. Yeah. But basically, young people don't really think through the consequences of their actions. I didn't. I'm sure most people didn't.
Oh, shit, no, of course not. You and I just have the benefit of the fact that our teenage years are not, there are not pictures of us and all of our mistakes available for everybody on the internet.
I made very few mistakes, but I certainly made some, and I wouldn't want everyone else to know them. And
a lot of my mistakes have to do with clothing or hair, and that's fine with me.
Yeah. I do have one or two pictures, but I did not put them on the internet of me and crazy Paisley or who knows what. So I think mostly young people don't realize the consequences of their actions, and they don't realize how other people see them. And again, partly it's because people mostly travel in small circles. Yeah. And it's not until you suddenly run up against a different group like, oh, I didn't realize you thought that was offensive. And here I am saying all this crazy stuff. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think people now are almost looking for things to take offense to. Like, how dare you wear a sari or a Chinese dress or something like that, which, anyway, these things have gotten magnified. And, we wouldn't have wanted all this on the internet. Actually, the 80s are almost a dark hole. It's very hard to find stuff about the 80s that's just out on the internet.
Yeah, the other thing about social media is that you don't know, like, if you're going to have to, like, when you are going to the border of a country and they're like, all right, so if you're going to come in, your Facebook and Twitter passwords, please. And now we're going to check out all of the things that you said. Oh, I thought I was just saying that to my friends. Oh no, we want to know what you're saying.
Right. And unfortunately, this whole issue of legalizing the marijuana. So, now people are like, well, maybe you shouldn't admit it at the border because it'll cause these problems. But if they're looking through your Facebook pages, that you may well have said something about getting high with your friends. So now you've actually committed a felony because you've lied to a border agent.
Exactly. What do you do then?
Yeah.
And if you're crossing the border and you live in Toronto, like, as soon as you're at customs, that's America.
Yeah. That's right.
That's America. And so
it's actually America inside Petersen Airport.
Exactly. Which is crazy. And they can actually do whatever the hell they want at that point.
So this is not in the play, but
it's interesting things to think about. And for me, one of the interesting things to think about is how it relates to, yes, it would be great to have access to all knowledge. But if everybody has access to all knowledge, then I'm not special.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, I think if we're honest with ourselves, the reason why we want to have access to all knowledge is so that we'll be special.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. So one of the teachers, actually, Mr. Miller, has this vision in his head that he will be able to help curate this. And because he's had so much more knowledge than most of his students, certainly, and other teachers, he'll be well placed to sort of be a curator and one of these taste makers.
Sure.
And another teacher says, well, maybe, but there's probably a few million people in your shoes, so maybe this isn't the best plan. Kind of reminds me of something a long time ago when I was in grad school, and I was doing well, but not well enough to make the cut, basically. And someone said, well, you think you're special, but maybe you just aren't good enough. It's like, wow, okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's maybe a little bit of that's coming to the surface in the play.
Well, I mean, we always draw from our own experience, even if it's not explicitly about us. We always put things from our own lives in there somewhere.
Right. But yeah, so I think there's no question if everyone has the same knowledge, then it becomes devalued. Who cares anymore? And probably people will still mostly focus on celebrities and their news, since that's drives 80% of the news feeds.
Sure. I mean, but another interesting question is if that's the case, then who's what makes somebody a celebrity? And besides that, we are now I know all the things that they know. I don't know. It's there's some really interesting questions in it.
Yeah.
Eric, at what point did you start writing for theater?
So I did very short plays in university, but only one of them. I was part of a group exercise that we put on a group show. Then I took a long break, and it wasn't until I was in Chicago. I was actually on the board of a theater company, and got really inspired by being around the actors, and I started writing a few short pieces and then a full-length piece. And we did table reads. We didn't actually do kind of a quasi-staged reading.
Yeah.
Then I came to Toronto. Okay, then in Vancouver, I've moved around a lot. In Vancouver, I was in a screenwriting class, and I finished a second full-length script, but again, not much happened with that. And then in Toronto, I guess 2014, I started writing mostly for the Sing for Your Supper, the stage reading, the cold reading event. And basically just there, mostly I tend to write 10 to 20 page short playlets, but this one came about and it just seemed the right time to try to put it in the Fringe.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you were in Chicago and then Vancouver. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Michigan.
Okay.
And but I spent a lot of time. Well, I spent about 5 years on the East Coast, mostly in New York, and then 10 or 12 years in Chicago, partly grad school and working.
Did you have a lot of exposure to theater when you were younger?
I would say a reasonable amount. My parents would take me to some of the theater. In high school, they took us to the university productions, and but where I grew up was a little smaller, so there weren't a lot of theater events. It really was university where I started going to basically everything. University of Michigan had a really good, sure it still does, but a very good drama program, and the Ann Arbor Civic Players, I think, had a good season as well. It's
interesting because one of the most, almost everybody that I've spoken to in 2 years of doing this podcast, they were exposed to some theater when they were a kid, and that affected them in some way, and that sort of speaks to the importance of parents and their willingness to take people, even if it's to the pantomime or whatever the theaters do it at Christmas.
Yeah.
There has to be a first exposure somewhere.
Right. Well, Chicago in particular is interesting because theater is so prevalent. It's becoming something that people will just do and take friends to. But you're right. In general, theater is seen as a very elite activity, and it's hard. I mean, I think the theater in the parks is a great thing because a lot of people find out about it that wouldn't go and maybe fall in love with more.
Yeah.
I mean, again, nothing at all wrong with theater in the parks, but then they want to explore more and go to, indoor performances. But yeah, it's difficult. So you kind of do need theater in the schools or, again, parents taking people to young people's theater or things in the park.
Yeah, because it is hard because most people, when they think about theater, they don't think about theater at the Storefront or the Red Sandcastle or any of the independent theaters, or sometimes even Factory Pass Mariah or Tarragon. They're thinking like the big, expensive Mirvish shows.
Mirvish or even Soulpepper, which is pretty pricey nowadays.
Yeah. And that's what they're thinking. That's why people are often like, oh, theater is not for me because I can't really afford it.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate Mooney's doesn't have a slightly bigger subscriber base because I think they're really great in terms of, really focusing on what are the cheap theater, $20, $25 or below.
Oh, the Mooney on Theater.
Yeah.
Blog. Yeah. I love the blog. I mean, obviously, from the way that it seems that theater criticism is going, I think that internet criticism is pretty much the only one of the few ways to get stuff out there.
Right.
But I don't know who's reading it. Like, are we looking for our own? Like, are we looking for ourselves? Are we reading about our friends or the people who are going there to find out? How do you find out about it?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to even get in the world. I mean, once you're there, then there's a lot of opportunities, and many of these companies do have some great deals for people under 30. I'm pretty sure Tarragon does, and certainly the other ones do. And there's plenty of independent theater that you can see for, $10 or $15 or $20. Yeah. So it's not, that's not nothing, but it's certainly not at all the same as Mirvish.
No, it's I mean, there's great stuff out there. It's just a matter of like people finding it, and that's one of the things that Fringe is great for. Like you have like, what is it, 12 days ish, 12-ish days, 10 to 12 days of a really affordable theater.
Right, and some of it even is free. There's things I think on the Fringe Pavilion that are essentially free. There's I'm pretty sure there's some stuff that's half price. This year they're doing preview tickets. We're actually going to have one preview. The first show is Thursday, and that'll be a preview show. So that'll be good if people are a little more budget conscious. And that
would be on the 4th of July.
Sounds good. 4th of July. Maybe we'll have
some fireworks.
Some fireworks, exactly. And the Fringe is also making a big effort to. There's sort of, I can't remember the exact programs, but basically, tickets are donated by the companies to children, basically, mostly high school children. I haven't totally decided if we're going to do that. I think ours is a relatively small production in terms of the seating, so it may not work as well. But yeah, there's a number of opportunities out there. Yeah.
And there's also the initiative that we're a part of, which is outside of the usual Fringe core, which is the site-specific locations, which are not in the usual boundaries.
Right. So this is a very exciting opportunity, and as the Fringe was saying, well, not everyone can come to the Fringe, so we'll go to the neighborhoods. And this year there are 6 site-specific shows not in the downtown core, including ours, Final Exam, which is in East York at Matty Eckler, which is the intersection of Gerrard and Pape. And there's another one on Danforth, and then there's at least 1 or 2 in Parkdale. So this is very exciting, and if it goes well, then next year the Fringe will have a few more. Yeah, and so if people are interested, this is certainly something to support. To check out the Fringe in outside the traditional areas. Yeah,
and also in some really interesting locations, because this show, Final Exam, is like we're basically creating a classroom that the audience is going to be part of.
Right.
Like, if you're sitting in that room, you're basically one of the students.
That's right. So there won't be any major participation from the audience.
Yeah, that's you're not going to be required to sing
take an
along
exam,
or anything,
right?
so,
exactly. But it is. I think it'll feel a lot like a classroom, and some of the others are in really interesting spaces as well. And I know there's going to be one promenade show, kind of in someone's front yard.
Wow,
going somewhere else. Last year there was a very successful promenade show that was in 3 locations somewhere. It went from like a little restaurant, and then it went into someone's garage, and then someone's patio.
Wow!
So that was fun.
That's fun.
And this one won't be so many places, but it'll still be outdoors. And I think those are great. Though, of course, you do have to watch a little for the weather.
Yeah. Well, that is the thing. You do have to keep your eye on that. Just to backtrack a little bit about you, Eric. You were, you did your time. Did some time in Chicago and Vancouver. As somebody traveling around, were you traveling around because that's where the work was, or did you? What brought you to Toronto?
So it was a bit of a mix. I'm not a professional performer or writer, so I have a side gig, which is a full-time gig in essentially consulting. And so the good news is we're often able to find jobs in urban areas, consultants are. And I was attracted by this particular job in Vancouver, and so we did pick up and move. And there was... and it was interesting, and I definitely enjoyed the job, but Vancouver wasn't quite for us. I'd actually lived in Toronto for 1 year in the early to mid 90s when I was at the University of Toronto, and I always thought, well, it'd be kind of great to come back.
Yeah.
And I was deep enough into the process that I was well on my way to a permanent residency card, and I said, well, I might as well stick with it. Why don't I go to Toronto instead of back to Chicago? And for me, it's been a very nice mix. Toronto has a really good cultural mix, a lot of concerts, a good art scene, a good theater scene. I mean, it doesn't compare to Chicago, but it is a good theater scene. And also for the kids, some great universities, and just... It's a kind of a nice mix. It's got a little bit of everything.
I've heard a lot of good things about Chicago, so about the theater scene there.
It's quite amazing. I would say it's probably 3 to 4 times the number of just shows. So you open up the reader, and it'll be 4 pages of openings almost every day. Wow! So you would there would be weeks I would go see 2 shows. Months where I'd say 2 shows every week. And it's not that you can't do it here, but it's a little bit harder.
You do have to look a little harder for it sometimes if you really...
Right. And most of it was kind of independent storefront theater. That's certainly the majority of what I went to.
Yeah, and I mean, we're sort of like in the position of here of sort of trying to rebuild our storefronts. I mean, Red Sandcastle has been there for a while. Assembly just reopened, or Unit 102 just opened with the Assembly, and storefront is perpetually in progress. The storefront theater. I look forward to when they...
Yeah, I talked very briefly with the new AD, and they're putting a business plan together, and they're hopeful, but it's going to be a challenge, and particularly they're hoping that this time around, on top of getting a new location, they can pay the actors more. And I'm like, well, good luck with that. Well, I'm very hopeful, but it's
that'd be great
tough
for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of storefront, when did you find Sing for Your Supper, and how did you find Sing for Your? And just storefront theater produced basically a cold reading series called Sing for Your Supper. It is not for musical theater. I've had so many people say, I would go, but I don't do musical theater. It's not musical theater. It's just cold readings of plays.
That's a really good question. I remember the first time I went to a storefront show, and that was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which was probably in 2014, 2015. And I don't know if they kind of advertised it there or it just happened to be something I happened to stumble across in the reviews of the not the reviews, but the listings of the Now magazine. But yeah, just it kind of appealed to me in this idea of throwing it up there, and I was very fortunate. My first piece was accepted, and I was like, "Oh, this will be a breeze." But no, the second and third weren't accepted. It took a while for me to kind of get my stride, and after a bit of a layoff, they've kind of returned, and I've been pretty successful writing short pieces for them the last few months. So
it's sort of a great little to go once a month and just sort of be in a room with a bunch of people and get a chance to read something. Sometimes it's like literally hot off the typewriter, computer, keyboard, whatever, but
yeah, it can be
new.
Most of it's only a week old, 2 weeks old.
So that could be really exciting, and it could be written by anybody.
Yeah, and they've been pretty lucky recently getting a lot of new writers, so they have to balance the older writers that are not even that established, but just kind of are better known quantities, and then the new folks. But it is really exciting to kind of see some new folks that haven't been there before and see what they can do. And as they say, nobody gets paid, so you just kind of show up for the community and to find out about what else is going on.
I think that's the big part of it is the community and the I think we have few opportunities to just be a community in this city. And it's a great chance to just sort of hang out for a bit and read something new.
And it's very supportive. And I would say the same thing about the Toronto Cold Reads, which is also a great reading series. It's got a slightly different thing. They usually show up every Sunday for about 2 months at a time, and then they take a bit of a hiatus and they come back for 2 months. So, it kind of depends. And a new thing that they've been doing this last couple of years is having a musical artist, which is nice to kind of just a different focus, a different kind of creativity.
Sure.
And the other thing that's a little different about Toronto Cold Reads is they tend to kind of get interested in projects that, it's a slice of a bigger piece, whereas Sing for Your Supper is almost always sort of standalone playlists.
They can be very much standalone, and I found that one of the differences between the two is a lot of the stuff that I was seeing at Toronto Cold Reads were screenplays.
Yes.
Whereas Sing for Your Supper is pretty much exclusively plays.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I will admit, a couple of them, I wish the person would cut half the stage directions, because screenplays have a lot of stage directions.
It's true. And it's good to, whenever I'm writing, I'm always if the stage, do I need the stage direction? I'm I don't put in a lot of stage direction. I'm not a Tennessee Williams or anything like that. Minimal.
Or Sarah Rule.
This is all minimal stuff. What do they need?
Yeah.
Because I know eventually somebody's going to just ignore that anyway and do their own things. So,
right.
But
you're right. There's no question a fair number of people at the Toronto Cold Reads are hoping to do either, TV writing or screenwriting. And I'm not sure, but I think the long-timers that keep coming back to Sing for Your Supper are not interested in the same way. They're a little more oriented toward the fringe. There have been some sort of previews of fringe productions. And you sometimes see that at Toronto Cold Reads as well.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, and it's good because I have occasionally seen crossover between the two people who go to, and some of the organizers from Toronto Cold Reads have shown up at Sing for Your Supper. So it's really good to have that sort of crossover, so that we're not working in silos. Do you remember the first thing that you wrote? Not necessarily for Cold Reads, but do you remember what the first thing that you wrote was?
Yes. So this would have been university. So the very first thing was actually a series of poems that got rolled up into this, what was it called? It was something that we put on in Ann Arbor. But I don't really count that because I only had a few poems that were part of it. I didn't write the linking material. The first thing was a short piece about two women in an office and a guy who was kind of bugging one of them for a date. And the women would kind of talk back and forth about their history. And I think at the end, the woman gave the guy a chance. They were going to go on a date, but she didn't. She said, I'm driving because the other woman had told her this weird story about how her parents had, basically, her father had threatened, he was so madly in love with her mother, he had threatened to drive off the side of the road if she wouldn't marry him. And the irony is this is actually a story I stole from somebody else. So I embedded this in there. And then she's like, oh, well, okay, we'll go out on a date, but I'm driving. Yeah. So I think I've always been attracted to humor and irony.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly quite a bit of it in Final Exam. There's a lot of humor. Although there's some dark stuff, a little bit of dark stuff in there too, which sort of balances out that humor.
Yeah, I was hoping for a pretty dark but humorous piece. You'll have to come and see for yourself.
Well, I think that there's like, I think a lot of people when they're talking about humor, they shy away from dark because they figure like, oh, if it's funny, it needs to be light and it needs to be, but there's sort of, that can kind of be dull after about 10 minutes. You know, having something that's heavy or a little darker can actually give some weight to what you're talking about.
I think there's definitely something to that. And many of the pieces that I know are never going to go longer than 10 or 15 minutes. Yeah, I mean, they're more or less a sketch, and it's fine. Yeah. But yeah, to maintain that for 40 plus minutes, I think you're right. You need something a little deeper. Yeah. People with the longer pieces expect character arcs. Yeah. I wouldn't say there's huge character arcs in here. There's bits of them. And so if you're not doing that, then you have to do something else. And I wouldn't say I was directly inspired by George F. Walker, but there's no question I find his really dark humor interesting. I've seen many of his plays. Yeah. Not that I really think this was a direct inspiration.
No, but it's interesting. Like I find the conversations that the high school students are having pretty interesting. Just because, you've got some who are completely into the idea of joining the hive mind, and others there's one character who may at one point have been like a star student, and now he's just
he's really kind of withdrawn into himself because he's so unhappy about the situation and kind of just gotten sarcastic. Because it's a little bit like one of those, a tiny bit like the To Serve Man thing, where it's like, don't you see this? How can I be the only one that doesn't see what's going on? Yeah. And of course, there are more people that have rejected this hive mind, and who knows? Toronto's population could be half of what it used to be. Sure. But we're going on the assumption that most people by 2050 are so used to not having any privacy, they hardly notice it.
But there's also the idea, I mean, a lot of times, people will go along with what they think is the majority opinion. Yeah. Like if everybody's doing it, if they think that everybody's into it, and I'm sure that in this world, the news has just been propagandizing. Yeah, everything's going to be great once this happens.
Yep, the government's for it. Yeah. So again, not a direct influence, but definitely something that I was thinking a little bit about was if you've seen any of the Amazon production of The Man in the High Castle. So both the TV series and the book talk about a situation where the U.S. has lost World War II, and the Nazis have pretty much taken over the whole East Coast. Actually, they go past the Mississippi, and yeah, people are just on board with it. Some people are totally on board with it, and some people are just okay with it. But there's very few true resistors. Yeah, and I see that a lot of that. I mean, you sort of look at different societies that have, I don't know. I mean, to get super political, I mean, Turkey or Ukraine North Korea is a little bit different, but a lot of places where, kind of a strong man comes into the Philippines actually is another really good example. And you're like, how could this be? And people are just like, well, they voted for it. They kind of wanted the top dog, and they've got it, and everything gets realigned. And so humans are pretty adaptable, and usually will kind of go with the flow. Yeah, because this is too hard to always be fighting.
It's exhausting to fight all the time.
It's completely exhausting, and so, I mean, not to be completely depressing about it, but I think, in the situation where the government has its own reasons for going along with this alien invasion, after a certain point, aliens are maybe a step beyond, but I mean, in general, the government kind of lays down the law and most people go along with it.
Well, that's absolutely true. Is the average person, because it's the law, they'll go along with it. Or whatever the government says, they're an authority, therefore we go along with it.
Right, and it doesn't take that many tastemakers to kind of, I mean, even if you had sort of government-sponsored tastemakers to sort of set the agenda, like it wouldn't take all that many to convince people for all kinds of crazy things. I mean, we're seeing some completely unbelievable realignments in the U.S. with, the Republicans essentially going along with Trump on downgrading the Russia as a threat. 10, 15, 20 years ago, this would be completely treasonous. And yet now it's,
Well, who would have thought that people who were white supremacists would complain that they were being discriminated against?
Well, actually, it doesn't surprise me. But,
I mean,
but that they be listened to seriously does surprise me.
Well, I mean, when I think about it, it's like when people are saying, when people are not, if you call, it used to be like if you called somebody a Nazi, that was one of the worst things you could say. And now if you call some people a Nazi, they're fine with it.
It's very depressing. Yeah. Maybe we should move back to something else.
I mean, one of the things, one of the challenges to producing in the Fringe is promoting the show.
Yes.
And how do you get noticed? And of course, we have an additional challenge with this show in that we're not right in the main Fringe area. Although hopefully the Fringe is like giving some support because of this new initiative.
Yeah.
Do you have a plan for how you're promoting the show?
Well, the podcast is a good start. We do have a Twitter page. It's Final Exam TO, and we're beginning to ramp that up. We'll be doing some postcards and posters, though, again, part of the issue is not being in the core makes it a little harder it's not harder to distribute, it's just, are you getting the right audience? We'll probably put more posters on Queen and Danforth if I can, make them look nice and convince some people to put them there. Definitely what we're going to do, I haven't yet, but I will talk very shortly to Councillor Fletcher's office and Peter Taubin's office and kind of let them know about it and try to make sure we're in the community newspaper. In fact, I do need to double check what their publication deadlines are. I should probably check tonight. But, those would be the main things. For better or worse, we don't have a huge number of seats. So I think we don't need to try to get 50 people in the seats every day. We are trying to get 20, 25, or 30. Sure. That would be ideal. And I don't know. I mean, I think we will do our best to sort of create a buzz. Like, this is something new. Some people really do like the site specifics. They are so different.
Yeah.
And they're way more intimate. And you'll, in this case, be right there with the actors and, the alien and the various people be running around. And some people really enjoy that.
Yeah.
So I think that's something we have to offer that most of the more traditional pieces won't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, we'll be blogging about it and definitely trying to get into the newspaper and the postering. And I don't have any big plans beyond that, but I'm certainly open.
Eric, are you aside from the final exam TO Twitter, are you on Twitter? Are you on the web at all?
I've got a blog. I don't have a Twitter account.
Okay.
So the blog is ericshangout.com or .ca.
Yeah.
So I do post there pretty regularly.
Okay. And you have a name that is also recognized.
Yes.
In a different. So do you ever have to be like? Because I think when you emailed me, it's like it's Eric Petersen, not that one.
Yeah. So this has been a bit of a running joke, though it's not as much of a joke at Sing for Your Supper as it used to be.
Sure.
So the first couple of times they thought it was Eric Petersen, the very famous actor from Corner Gas and from a number of amazing Billy Bishop and a number of amazing productions. The first time I actually managed to see him, I think was in something up in North York. And I didn't introduce myself or anything, but I just was amused, like having the universe with the two Eric Petersens in the same place.
Yeah.
But I have occasionally emailed theater companies with a suggestion or a comment, and and they take it much more seriously until I realize that no, I'm not that famous Eric Petersen. Not as well known, but there's an Eric Petersen with even closer spelling that was the lead in Shrek the Musical in Broadway.
Okay.
So that was even more confusion. But I think I don't know, I'm assuming he's still acting, but he's not as active as he was, and so it's not as much of a problem. But there's no question. Sing for Your Supper, they would always make a joke about not being the famous Eric Petersen. And one time, actually, Tarragon almost gave me Eric Petersen's address because we were trying to verify who I was and if I had the right account. So one of these days, I probably will meet him, but I don't know. I'm not going to make a big play on that because I think that would be wrong. I don't want to trade on anyone else's fame.
No, it's true. Well, Eric, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Did you want to say anything about your thoughts of the part?
Oh, geez. Well, I actually feel like because I'm playing Mr. Miller, who's the teacher that is on board with the hive mind, and I feel like he's. I think he's looking for a way. Like the reason why he's on board is he is looking for a way to remain special, because he doesn't feel like he can do the running away thing. I feel like he's trapped, but there's also he feels like he can still be special and work within the government's whatever. He's. I mean, obviously, as is pointed out, like he's not that special.
He's certainly fallen pretty far. He's at a not so great school.
No, he's at a kind of a shitty school.
I wouldn't even go that far, but it's not a great school.
It's not okay. So he's not a great school, but it's also, I mean, and his students are. He basically doesn't have control of his class. Whether he ever did, or whether this is a result of
the aliens,
and all that stuff is up for debate. But, I mean, he can barely keep control of his class. And it's almost, I don't even know how much he's trying anymore. And it's interesting that he's so willing to go along with this until he figures out that maybe he's not so special. It's like, oh, I won't be special? Well, I'm out of here. Almost.
Kinda. I think it's I think it's some stuff that he hadn't really processed or thought through, and there's like a new alternative on the horizon, perhaps some other options.
No, you're right. I think that he hasn't really processed it. He hasn't thought too hard about it, which I think is kind of what most people who are in this situation or haven't done them. Well, a lot of people have not really thought it through.
Well, let's put it this way. If something terrible was coming to Toronto, I don't know, SARS 2 or something like that, and you'd be like, well, I can stay in Toronto and take my chances, or I can go to Whitehorse or some other god-awful place.
Yeah.
I don't know. Toronto's pretty nice.
Yeah. It's like, also it's the place you know. Yeah. And it's difficult to leave the place you know, especially if you think, no, I can make this work for me.
Right. He's bought, I wouldn't say he's fully drunk in the Kool-Aid, but he's drunk enough of it that he's like, okay, it's okay. I'll be fine.
He'll be fine.
I have to admit, I was a high school teacher for a couple years, and I wasn't very good at it. I mean, I knew the material, but I didn't have control over the students. Yeah. Now, part of that was they had intentionally given the new teachers the worst classes. But, yeah.
I think that it would be really hard, like, even for a really good teacher to keep control of their class under these circumstances. Like,
yes,
these kids don't really care. I mean, we're talking about, like, in a couple of weeks, they're already going to know everything.
Right.
Like, as far as everything, I think if I'm sure that the students are like, look, I don't even need to be here because in like 2 weeks, I know everything you do anyway.
Exactly.
So what's the point?
I mean, not that this would ever happen, but it was kind of it's kind of the original impetus of the whole thing. Like, so yeah, we wouldn't have teachers? We probably won't have libraries.
Yeah.
Who knows what we'll have if everyone knew everything?
Yeah. Well, who knows if we even need like jobs or what does the world become? So,
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know.
Tune in and find out.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks a lot, Eric.
Thanks.
This has been a Homebody Productions production.